It was the winter of 1927. The wrecking balls swung through the cold New York air, smashing into walls that had once hosted presidents and princes. Dust rose in clouds above Fifth Avenue as marble crumbled and gilded ceilings crashed to the ground. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk, some with tears in their eyes, watching as the largest private residence ever built in New York City was systematically destroyed. That building was the Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion, a palace so grand it had 130 rooms, a ballroom that could hold 1,200 guests, and halls lined with more art than most museums. It had stood for only 45 years. Now it was being erased from existence, torn down not because it was ugly or useless, but because the world had changed. The age of private palaces was over, and New York wanted something new. But to understand why this magnificent fortress of wealth was demolished, why one of America's most powerful families would destroy their own monument, we must travel back in time to understand the man who built it, the empire that made it possible, and the dream that consumed him until his final breath. To understand the man who built America's greatest palace, we must start with the boy who inherited an empire. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was born on November 27, 1843, into a family that was already tasting the intoxicating flavor of power. His grandfather, the original Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had started with absolutely nothing. Born to a poor ferry operator on Staten Island, the Commodore had built an empire through steamships and railroads, through ruthless business tactics and an iron will that broke competitors like twigs. By the time he died in 1877, he was worth over $100 million, making him the richest man in America and one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire world. By the time young Cornelius II could walk, by the time he could understand the world around him, the family name meant something profound. It meant money, yes, but more than that. It meant power, influence, and an insatiable hunger for more that seemed to run in the blood itself. His father, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the Commodore's fortune and proved he was more than just a lucky heir. Through shrewd railroad investments, careful management, and an understanding of business that rivaled his father's, William Henry doubled the family fortune in less than a decade. The Vanderbilts weren't just wealthy in the way that merchants or bankers were wealthy. They were a dynasty in the making, an American aristocracy rising in a nation that claimed not to believe in such things. And young Cornelius II was being groomed, carefully and deliberately, to carry that legacy forward into the next generation. From his earliest years, he understood that he was different, that his last name opened doors that remained closed to others, that his future was already written in the ledgers of the family's railroad empire. But unlike his ruthless grandfather, who had crushed competitors without mercy, unlike his father who viewed business as warfare by other means, Cornelius II was a fundamentally different kind of man. He was serious where the Commodore had been brash, religious where his grandfather had been skeptical, and he believed deeply in responsibility, duty, and the moral obligations that came with wealth. Where the Commodore had been loud, crude, and willing to use any tactic to win, Cornelius II was refined, disciplined, and believed that gentlemen should behave with honor, even in business. His mother, Maria Louisa Kissam, raised him with strict Victorian values that would shape his entire life. Church every Sunday without fail, no gambling under any circumstances, no wild behavior that might bring shame to the family name. While other wealthy young men of his generation drank champagne, gambled fortunes at cards, and chased actresses through the night, Cornelius studied. He learned the railroad business from his father, spending hours memorizing routes, costs, profit margins, and the intricate details of managing thousands of miles of track and tens of thousands of employees. By his early 20s, while other young men of privilege were touring Europe or lounging in gentlemen's clubs, Cornelius was already managing sections of the family's vast railroad network. He worked alongside experienced managers, learning how to handle labor disputes, negotiate with suppliers, and navigate the complex political landscape that governed the railroad industry. He didn't just inherit power. He earned his place at the table through relentless work, careful attention to detail, and a seriousness of purpose that impressed even hardened railroad men who had worked for his grandfather. His father trusted him with increasingly important responsibilities. His grandfather, before his death in 1877, had seen something special in the young man, a quality that was rare among the children of wealthy families. He had discipline, he had focus, and he had the kind of seriousness of purpose that would be needed to protect the family's empire for generations to come, to guard it against competitors who circled constantly like wolves waiting for any sign of weakness. In 1867, at age 24, Cornelius II married Alice Claypool Gwynn, the daughter of a respected Cincinnati lawyer. The marriage was arranged in the way that marriages among the wealthy were always arranged, carefully negotiated between families to ensure compatibility of fortune, breeding, and social standing. But it proved to be far more than a business arrangement. Alice was everything that society demanded of a proper wife, and everything that Cornelius needed in a partner. She was elegant and beautiful, yes, but also intelligent and capable. She spoke French fluently, had studied art and music in Europe, played piano beautifully, and understood exactly what was expected of a woman who would become one of the leading society figures in America. She was born to the role, trained for it, and she would execute it with precision and grace that few could match. Together, Cornelius and Alice would have 7 children: Cornelius III, William, Reginald, Alfred, Gertrude, Alice, and Gladys. Each child represented not just another member of the family, but another link in the chain of dynasty, another bearer of the Vanderbilt name into the future. Alice became the anchor of Cornelius's life, the one person who could soften his rigid exterior, who could make him smile when business troubles weighed heavily on his shoulders. While he worked 14 and 16-hour days managing railroads, answering telegrams at all hours, and fighting battles against rival railroad barons, she managed their growing household, their increasingly complex social obligations, and their place in the rigid hierarchy of New York society. And as their wealth grew, as Cornelius rose to take his father's place at the head of the family empire, their ambitions grew as well. They wanted a home, but not just any home. They wanted something that reflected not just their fortune, but their position as leaders of American aristocracy, as the family that stood at the very pinnacle of wealth and power in the Gilded Age. By the 1870s, New York City was transforming with breathtaking speed. The old Knickerbocker families, descendants of Dutch settlers who had controlled society for generations through inherited land and old connections, were being challenged and in many cases displaced by new money. The Astors, who had made their fortune in fur trading and real estate, were building palaces. The Belmonts, banking tycoons, were doing the same. And especially the Vanderbilts, whose railroad fortune dwarfed almost everyone else's, were building monuments that made the old brownstones of inherited wealth look like servants' quarters. Fifth Avenue, which had once been a quiet residential street lined with modest townhouses, was becoming a battleground of architectural one-upmanship, with each family trying to outdo their neighbors in displays of wealth and taste. If you wanted to matter in New York society, if you wanted to be taken seriously by the families that controlled social access and determined who was in and who was forever out, you needed more than money. You needed a mansion that announced your arrival, that made people stop and stare, that dominated its surroundings like a fortress dominating a battlefield. For Cornelius II and Alice, who were still living in a respectable but relatively modest townhouse on Fifth Avenue, the time had come to build their dream. The townhouse was fine for a young couple starting out, adequate for raising small children, but it wasn't enough. Not for the grandson of the Commodore. Not for a man who was being positioned to lead the family's vast business empire, to succeed his father as chairman of the New York Central Railroad. Not for a woman who was expected to host presidents, entertain European nobility, and set the standard for American society. They needed something that would dwarf everything around it, something that would make even the Astor Mansion look modest by comparison, something that would stand for centuries as a monument to the Vanderbilt name and the empire they had built. In 1879, after months of searching and negotiation, they purchased an entire city block on the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. The location was absolutely perfect, chosen with the same care that Cornelius applied to every business decision. It was high enough above the commercial district to feel exclusive and residential, far enough from the noise and chaos of lower Manhattan to provide the peaceful environment expected of a proper home. But it was also central enough to be seen by everyone who mattered, visible to every carriage that traveled up 5th Avenue, impossible to ignore or overlook. The plot was enormous by Manhattan standards, stretching 200 feet along 5th Avenue and 100 feet along 57th Street. It was an immense piece of land in a city where every square foot cost a fortune, where property values were climbing every year as Manhattan became the economic capital of America. But for the Vanderbilts, cost was never an obstacle or even a serious consideration. It was merely a tool, a way to show the world that they had ascended beyond the normal rules that governed ordinary people, that they existed in a realm where money was simply a means to achieve whatever they desired. The architect they chose was George B. Post, one of New York's most respected and accomplished designers. Post had studied at the finest architectural schools, had traveled extensively in Europe studying the great palaces in chateaux, and understood better than almost anyone how to blend European grandeur with American ambition and modern technology. When Cornelius and Alice sat down with him in his office to discuss their vision for the mansion, they brought sketches and photographs from their own trips to France, images of the great chateau of the Loire Valley, of Versailles, of the palaces they had visited and fallen in love with. They wanted something that captured that European magnificence, that sense of history and permanence, but adapted to American tastes and modern life. They wanted a chateau, something that looked like it had been lifted whole from the French countryside and placed in the heart of Manhattan, a building that would make visitors feel like they had stepped through a portal into another world entirely. Construction began immediately in early 1880, and from the very first day, it was clear this would be no ordinary building project. First came the foundation work, and it was massive in a way that few people could appreciate. Workers dug down through layers of Manhattan bedrocks, going deeper than any residential building had gone before, creating cellars and sub-basements that would hold wine, coal, mechanical systems, and storage space. The foundation had to be strong enough to support walls of solid masonry, floors of marble and hardwood, and ceilings heavy with plaster, gold leaf, and massive crystal chandeliers. Engineers calculated every stress point, every load-bearing wall, making sure the structure would stand for centuries. Then came the stone. Thousands upon thousands of tons of carved limestone shipped from quarries in Indiana, considered the finest building material available in America. Each block was cut by skilled masons, men who had learned their craft over decades, fitted together with precision that would have impressed the medieval cathedral builders of Europe. The mansion began to rise, floor by floor, room by room, week by week, until it towered above its neighbors like a fortress, like a castle transported through time and space. The design was pure French Renaissance, inspired specifically by the chateau built during the reign of Francis I in the 16th century. The facade featured steep slate roofs that rose at dramatic angles, ornate dormers that broke the roofline and added visual interest, and towers that seemed to scrape the sky, their peaks visible from blocks away. Windows were tall and elegant, framed by elaborate carved stone details that had taken craftsmen weeks to create. Balconies jutted out at strategic points, offering views down 5th Avenue and across to Central Park. Every surface was considered, every detail refined through multiple drawings and revisions. This wasn't just a house, wasn't just a place to live. It was a statement carved in limestone and marble, a declaration that the Vanderbilts had arrived at the very summit of American society and intended to stay there. By 1882, just 3 years after construction began, the mansion was complete, at least in its initial form. Because for Cornelius and Alice, the building would never truly be finished, never be perfect. It would continue to grow and evolve over the next decade as their wealth increased, as their social ambitions expanded, and as they discovered new ways to express their vision through architecture. But even in its initial form, before the grand expansion of the 1890s, the house was absolutely staggering in scale and magnificence. It rose 4 full stories above street level, plus a full basement and attic level, making it one of the tallest residential structures in New York. The main entrance on Fifth Avenue featured a massive carved doorway, a portal that seemed designed for giants, that opened into a vestibule lined with rare marble imported from Italian quarries. The marble had been carefully selected, each piece chosen for its color and grain, creating patterns that flowed across the walls like frozen water. Beyond the vestibule lay the Great Hall, and this is where visitors always stopped, where they always gasped, where they first understood the scale of what they had entered. The hall was a soaring space that rose 3 full floors, creating a volume of air and light that seemed impossible in a private home. A grand staircase rose along one wall, its carved oak banister polished to a mirror shine by servants who spent hours each week maintaining it. The staircase was a work of art in itself, each newel post carved with elaborate designs, each step made from perfectly matched wood, the whole thing flowing upward in a graceful curve that drew the eye toward the upper floors. The ceiling above was covered in elaborate plasterwork, intricate patterns and designs painted in cream and gold. With crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, there are thousands of prisms catching and reflecting light from the tall windows. Natural light poured through stained glass windows, masterpieces commissioned from European artists, casting colored patterns across the marble floors. The patterns changed throughout the day as the sun moved, creating an ever-shifting display of blues, reds, greens, and golds. Visitors who stepped through those doors for the first time often stopped in their tracks, stunned into silence by the grandeur, feeling that they had entered a world that existed nowhere else in America, perhaps nowhere else on Earth. The main floor was a masterpiece of design and display, every room serving multiple purposes, functional yet also theatrical, meant to be lived in but also meant to impress and overwhelm. To the left of the Great Hall was the drawing room, and it was a space of almost painful elegance, so refined and beautiful that people were almost afraid to sit down, afraid to disturb the perfection. The walls were covered in silk damask, deep crimson with gold patterns woven through the fabric by craftsmen in Lyon, France, using techniques perfected over centuries. Gilded moldings framed the ceiling, the gold leaf applied so carefully that it seemed to glow with inner light. French furniture filled the space, not reproductions but genuine Louis XV pieces purchased at auction from French aristocrats who had fallen on hard times. Chairs with legs carved like twisted rope, tables with tops of inlaid marble, a desk that had once belonged to a countess. This was where Alice received guests during the afternoon, where society ladies gathered for tea and gossip, where they discussed fashion and scandal, where reputations were made and destroyed with a single cutting remark or a strategic exclusion from the next ball. Alice presided over these gatherings like a queen holding court, always gracious but also always aware of the power she wielded. Across the hall from the drawing room, the library offered a completely different atmosphere, darker and more masculine, a retreat from the feminine softness of the other spaces. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, custom-built from dark mahogany, held thousands of volumes. First editions, rare manuscripts, contemporary novels, books on business and economics and history. Cornelius spent his evenings here, reading by lamplight after long days managing the railroad, studying business reports and financial statements, planning the next expansion of the family's empire. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, of old paper and wood polish, scents that became for Cornelius the smell of comfort and home. A massive desk sat near the tall windows, positioned so he could look out over Fifth Avenue and see the city he was helping to shape. The endless stream of carriages and pedestrians, the other mansions rising on neighboring blocks. The desk was always covered with papers, telegrams, reports from railroad managers in Chicago and Buffalo and Albany. Constant reminders that the empire required constant attention, that power demanded constant vigilance. But the true masterpiece, the space that would become legendary, was the ballroom. It wasn't part of the original 1882 design. That came later, during a major expansion in 1892, when Cornelius and Alice realized they needed more space for entertaining, more room to display their social power. They hired Richard Morris Hunt, perhaps the greatest American architect of the era, designer of the breakers in Newport, to create the ballroom of their dreams. And what he created was beyond dreams. It was the largest private ballroom in New York City, a room that made even the ballrooms in the Astor Mansion seem modest. The space stretched nearly 60 feet long and 50 feet wide, with ceilings that soared 30 feet above the polished parquet floor. The walls were covered in gold leaf, thin sheets of real gold applied by craftsmen who had trained for years to master the technique. Sheets so thin you could see light through them, but which created a surface that shimmered and glowed in candlelight and gaslight like something from a fairy tale. At one end, a musician's gallery, a balcony large enough to hold a full orchestra, allowed musicians to play while guests danced below. The sound filling the space with waltzes and polkas and the latest ragtime rhythms from America's emerging popular music scene. The room could comfortably hold 1,200 people, and during the peak of the social season, during January and February when New York society was at its most active, it often did hold that many. Invitations to a Vanderbilt ball were the most coveted pieces of paper in New York, more valuable than stock certificates, more sought after than opera tickets. To be invited meant you had arrived, that you were part of the inner circle, that your family had been accepted into the highest reaches of American society. To be excluded, to not receive that thick cream-colored envelope with your name written in perfect calligraphy, meant social death, meant you were nobody, meant your children might struggle for years to recover the ground you had lost. Alice understood this power perfectly, understood it in her bones, and she wielded it with grace and precision that amazed even other society leaders. She wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty, wasn't petty or vindictive, but she was strategic. Every guest list was carefully considered, debated, revised. Every seating arrangement at dinner was planned to perfection, placing rivals far apart, putting potential allies next to each other, using the architecture of the room itself as a tool of social engineering. The ballroom wasn't just a room. It was a stage where New York's elite performed their carefully choreographed dance of power and status, where fortunes could shift based on who you spoke with, where marriages were arranged through seemingly casual conversations, where business deals were made between waltzes. The chandeliers alone, massive crystal creations imported from France at enormous expense, were worth more than most people would earn in their entire lives. Each one had been designed specifically for this room, with thousands of individual crystal prisms that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns across the golden walls. At night, when the chandeliers were lit, when the orchestra was playing, when hundreds of guests in their finest clothes filled the space, the ballroom became something magical, something that seemed to exist outside normal reality, a glimpse of how the gods might live if gods walked among mortals. The dining room was equally impressive, though in a different way, more intimate despite its enormous size. It was a long rectangular space capable of seating 60 guests at a single massive mahogany table that stretched almost 40 feet from end to end. The table had been commissioned from the finest furniture makers in New York, built from a single tree, a massive mahogany that had grown for centuries in the forests of Honduras before being cut, shipped north, and transformed into this monument to craftsmanship. The walls were paneled in carved English oak, imported panel by panel from a Tudor-era manor house that had been demolished in the English countryside. Each panel depicted scenes from classical mythology and medieval history, carved by craftsmen whose names were lost to time but whose skill was evident in every detail. Hercules battling the Hydra, knights on horseback charging toward battle, Greek gods feasting on Mount Olympus. The ceiling was coffered, divided into geometric sections, each one painted in rich burgundy and gold, creating a pattern that seemed to vibrate with color and life. Between the oak panels hung tapestries from Flemish workshops, masterpieces of the weaver's art created in the 16th and 17th centuries. Their threads of silver and gold still gleamed after centuries, still caught the light and threw it back, still told their stories of hunts and battles and courtly love. At the head of the massive table, Cornelius presided over dinners that could last for 4 or 5 hours, course after course of French cuisine prepared by a staff of European-trained chefs working in the massive kitchens in the basement. The dinners followed a pattern that never varied, a ritual as fixed as church services. First came oysters on ice, served with champagne. Then turtle soup with sherry, the turtles imported live from the Caribbean and kept in tanks in the basement until needed. Then fish, usually sole or salmon, prepared with delicate sauces. Then a palate cleanser, perhaps a sorbet flavored with champagne and lemon. Then the main courses, roasted pheasant with truffle sauce, or beef Wellington, or lamb with mint, or duck with orange. Then salad, then cheese, then elaborate desserts that looked like architectural sculptures, sponge sugar creations that took pastry chefs hours to create. Cakes layered with buttercream and decorated with flowers made from sugar and marzipan. Wine flowed from the temperature-controlled cellars in the basement, bottles that Cornelius had been collecting for decades, some of them from vineyards that no longer existed, vintages from legendary years that could never be repeated, Bordeaux from the great chateau of France, Burgundy from tiny family estates, champagne from houses that supplied European royalty. Each wine was carefully chosen to complement its course, brought to table at exactly the right temperature, poured by liveried footmen who had been trained for months in the proper technique. Between courses, conversation buzzed with gossip about politics, business deals, social scandals, and European affairs. These dinners weren't just meals, weren't just about food and drink. They were performances, carefully choreographed displays of wealth, taste, and power, opportunities for Cornelius to solidify business relationships, for Alice to strengthen social alliances, for the family to demonstrate their position at the very peak of American society. Upstairs, away from the public rooms where guests were received and entertained, the private quarters told a different story, a more intimate story of how Cornelius and Alice actually lived. Like most wealthy couples of the Victorian era, they maintained separate bedroom suites, sleeping apart not because of any lack of affection, but because that's simply how things were done in their world. His rooms were relatively simple compared to the grandeur below, furnished with heavy dark wood furniture and minimal decoration. Cornelius preferred function over flair in his personal space, preferred an environment that was restful and practical rather than showy. His bedroom contained a large 4-poster bed with simple curtains, a dressing room with mahogany wardrobes holding his extensive collection of suits and formal wear, and a private bathroom, one of the first in any New York residence to have full modern plumbing. The bathroom was a marvel of modern technology, with a massive marble tub, gold fixtures that never tarnished, and hot running water provided by steam boilers in the basement that heated water on demand, a luxury that most New Yorkers wouldn't have for decades to come. Alice's suite occupied an entire wing of the second floor, a series of connected rooms that together were larger than most fashionable apartments in the city. Her bedroom was a fantasy of feminine elegance, walls covered in pale blue silk hand-painted with delicate floral patterns by artists brought from Paris specifically for this purpose. The furniture was French, painted in soft pastels, elegant and graceful, each piece chosen to complement the others in creating a harmonious whole. A canopy bed draped with Belgian lace dominated the room, its mattress stuffed with the finest down, its sheets made from Egyptian cotton so fine it felt like silk against the skin. Her dressing room was a separate chamber, larger than most New York apartments, filled with custom-built wardrobes that held hundreds of gowns, each one a masterpiece of the dressmaker's art. She had morning dresses for receiving guests at home, afternoon dresses for paying social calls, tea gowns for informal entertaining, evening gowns for dinners, and ball gowns for the grandest occasions. Each gown had been made specifically for her by the finest dressmakers in Paris, London, and New York, sewn by hand over weeks or months, fitted and refitted until every line was perfect, every detail exactly right. She owned jewelry worth millions in today's currency, enough to buy entire city blocks. Diamonds from South Africa, each stone carefully selected for its clarity and fire. Pearls from the South Pacific that had taken decades to grow to their impressive size. Emeralds from the mountains of Colombia that glowed with an inner green light. Sapphires from Ceylon that ranged from pale blue to deep navy. All of it was kept in velvet-lined cases in a hidden safe built into the wall, protected by locks that required 2 keys, one held by Alice and one by the butler. Every morning, her personal maid helped her dress, a process that could take more than an hour depending on the day's activities and the level of formality required. The maid would first help her into her undergarments, the corset that shaped her figure, the petticoats that gave her skirts their shape, the stockings held up with garters. Then would come the dress itself, often weighing 20 or 30 pounds with all its fabric and decoration, requiring 2 people to lift it over her head and settle it into place. Then jewelry, chosen to complement the dress and the occasion. Then hair, styled with hot irons into elaborate arrangements that could take an hour to create. By the time Alice emerged from her dressing room, she was transformed into the perfect image of a society queen. Not a hair out of place, every detail perfect, ready to face whatever social challenges the day might bring. The children's floor above was a world unto itself, separated from the adult floors by both physical distance and social custom. Nurseries were decorated with cheerful murals showing scenes from fairy tales and Mother Goose rhymes, painted by artists who specialized in children's spaces. Playrooms were filled with the finest toys money could buy, rocking horses with real horsehair manes, doll houses that were perfect replicas of real mansions, toy soldiers made from tin and painted by hand, books with leather bindings and gilt-edged pages. Each of the 7 children had their own bedroom, decorated according to their age and gender, with individual furniture and personal touches that made each space unique. Separate quarters housed the small army of nannies, governesses, and tutors who were responsible for raising and educating the Vanderbilt children according to the strict standards their parents demanded. The children, Cornelius III, William, Reginald, Alfred, Gertrude, Alice, and Gladys, were raised in luxury that most people couldn't begin to imagine, surrounded by servants who attended to their every need. But they were also raised with strict discipline that would have surprised outsiders who assumed wealthy children were spoiled. They had the best education money could provide, but they were expected to work hard at their studies. Private tutors taught them French, German, Latin, mathematics, literature, history, and the sciences. Music teachers came several times a week to give piano and violin lessons. Dancing masters taught them the waltzes and formal dances they would need for society balls. Art instructors taught them to paint and draw. But beyond academics, they were also taught the complex social rules of their class, lessons that were perhaps more important than anything they learned from books. They learned how to enter a room properly, how to greet guests with exactly the right level of warmth or formality depending on the person's rank, how to make conversation without saying anything that might cause offense, how to eat properly at formal dinners where there might be 8 or 10 different forks and spoons and glasses, each one meant for a specific course. They learned which topics were appropriate for polite conversation and which must never be mentioned. They learned how to dress for different occasions, how to address servants, how to behave at church, at the opera, at social calls. Cornelius insisted his children understand that wealth brought obligations, that with great fortune came great responsibility. They were expected to behave properly at all times, to study diligently, to attend church regularly, and to prepare themselves for lives of service to family and society. The mansion wasn't just a home where they happened to grow up. It was a training ground for the next generation of American aristocracy, a place where children learned from birth the complex rules of elite society, absorbing through daily observation how power operated, how money talked, how social position was maintained and defended. Below ground, in the basement and sub-basement levels that most guests never saw and barely knew existed, the servants' world operated like a separate kingdom, a hidden realm that made possible all the luxury and ease that the family enjoyed upstairs. More than 40 full-time staff members lived and worked in the mansion, creating and maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury for those who lived on the floors above. There were butlers and footmen in livery, ladies' maids who attended to Alice and the older daughters, parlor maids who cleaned the public rooms, chambermaids who cleaned the bedrooms, kitchen maids who assisted the cooks, scullery maids who washed dishes and cleaned pots, laundresses who handled the endless mountains of linens and clothes, seamstresses who repaired and altered garments, and maintenance workers who kept the building's systems running. They rose before dawn, sometimes as early as 4 or 4:30 in the morning, to begin their daily routines. Fires had to be lit in every fireplace before the family woke, dozens of them scattered throughout the mansion's 130 rooms. Coal had to be carried up from the basement in heavy hods. Ashes from the previous day's fires had to be carried down. Breakfast had to be prepared, starting with simple porridge and toast for the servants themselves, then elaborate meals for the family. Eggs cooked exactly to order, bacon and sausages, toast with butter and marmalade, fresh fruit, coffee and tea. The house had to be ready, every surface dusted, every floor swept or mopped, every room aired and cleaned before the family began their day. They worked until long after the Vanderbilts went to bed, often past midnight after large dinners and parties, cleaning up the aftermath, washing mountains of dishes, polishing silver that would be used again the next day, preparing for tomorrow's tasks that would begin in just a few hours. The work was endless, physically exhausting, and largely invisible to those who lived upstairs. That was the point, actually. Good servants were supposed to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to appear when needed and vanish when not, to make everything seem to happen automatically as if by magic. The family rarely spoke directly to servants except to give orders to the butler or housekeeper, who would then relay instructions down the hierarchy. Most servants never spoke to family members at all, communicating only through gestures and by reading the subtle signals that indicated what was wanted. It was a strange existence, living in this palace of luxury but never really being part of it, surrounded by beauty and wealth, but never able to touch it or claim it as their own, working impossible hours for wages that seemed generous compared to factory work, but were still barely enough to save anything after expenses. The kitchen was a massive operation occupying a huge space in the basement, with vaulted brick ceilings blackened by decades of smoke, and floors of quarry tile that were scrubbed daily but always looked stained. Coal-fired ranges with multiple ovens ran along one entire wall, these iron monsters that required constant attention, constant feeding with coal, constant adjustment of vents, and dampers to maintain the right temperatures for different dishes. Ice boxes the size of small rooms, their walls lined with cork for insulation, held meat, fish, and dairy products, kept cold by massive blocks of ice that were delivered daily by ice wagons and had to be manhandled down the service stairs. A staff of 12 worked in the kitchen full-time, led by a French chef named Armand, who had been lured away from a Paris restaurant with the promise of an enormous salary and total control over his domain. Armand demanded absolute perfection and screamed at anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards, throwing pots and pans when particularly enraged. But the food that came from his kitchen was extraordinary, as good as anything served in the finest restaurants of New York or Paris. The kitchen staff could prepare elaborate meals for hundreds of guests on short notice, working through the night if necessary, their hands constantly moving, chopping and stirring and baking and roasting. On the night of a major ball, the kitchen would prepare not just dinner for the family and their closest guests, but also supper for the ball guests. A light meal served around midnight consisting of dozens of different dishes, cold meats and salads, lobster and oysters, ices and pastries and cakes. The amount of food required was staggering. The logistics of timing everything so it was ready exactly when needed was incredibly complex, and mistakes were not tolerated. A sauce that broke, a roast that was overcooked, a soufflé that fell, any of these could result in instant dismissal, being sent out with no references, unable to find work in any wealthy household in New York. The laundry room, located in the sub-basement to keep its heat and humidity away from the upper floors, was its own kind of hell. Giant copper washing tubs stood in rows, each one large enough to hold hundreds of pounds of linens, heated by steam pipes from the basement boilers that raised the water temperature to scalding levels. 6 women worked there full-time, their hands permanently red and chapped from constant immersion in hot water and lye soap, their backs aching from bending over the tubs, their days filled with endless loads of washing. Drying racks that could be raised and lowered on pulleys filled one wall. Ironing stations with heavy flat irons that had to be heated on stoves occupied another. Every piece of linen, every napkin, every tablecloth, every sheet, every piece of clothing worn by family or guests or servants had to be washed by hand in that scalding water and then pressed to absolute perfection with those heavy irons. The amount of laundry generated by the household was almost unbelievable. Alice alone changed clothes 3 or 4 times per day, each outfit generating multiple pieces that needed washing. The dress itself, the undergarments, the stockings, the gloves, if she was going out. The children went through clothes at an even faster rate, playing and getting dirty despite the best efforts of their nannies. Cornelius needed fresh shirts daily, sometimes twice daily if he had evening engagements. The table linens alone, the tablecloths and napkins used at every meal, generated enormous loads of washing. After a large dinner party, there might be 60 napkins to wash, each one requiring individual attention to remove food stains and wine spills. The work never stopped, never slowed, never became easier. By the early 1890s, after a decade of living in the mansion, the Vanderbilt residence had become far more than just a home, or even just the most impressive private residence in New York. It had become the social center of the entire city, the ultimate symbol of Gilded Age excess and ambition, the place where power, wealth, and influence converged in ways that shaped the future of American society. The annual Vanderbilt Ball, held every January during the height of the social season, was the event that everyone talked about for months before and months after. It was covered extensively not just in New York newspapers but in papers across the country, with society reporters camping out on Fifth Avenue for hours before the event, noting which carriages arrived, which guests attended, what they wore, which jewels they displayed, and most importantly, who was conspicuously absent. The society columns the next day would be studied like sacred texts by anyone who wanted to understand the current state of New York's social hierarchy, who was rising, who was falling, who had gained favor, and who had lost it. Alice's guest lists were analyzed by social commentators with the same attention that political analysts gave to election results. Every invitation sent was a statement. Every exclusion was a judgment. Politicians actively courted invitations to Vanderbilt events, hoping to gain favor with Cornelius, whose railroad empire gave him enormous political influence both in Albany and Washington. A single word from Cornelius could make or break legislation, could determine whether a politician's career flourished or withered. Artists and musicians performed at Vanderbilt soirees, knowing that an endorsement from the family, a positive comment from Alice about a performance, could launch their careers overnight, could mean the difference between struggling in obscurity and achieving fame and fortune. A young soprano who sang at a Vanderbilt dinner might find herself in demand at the Metropolitan Opera the following week. A painter whose work hung in the Vanderbilt Mansion might suddenly find wealthy collectors clamoring to commission portraits. The mansion was visited by European royalty with increasing frequency as America's wealth became impossible for even the oldest European families to ignore. The Grand Duke Alexei of Russia came and marveled at the display, admitting privately that it rivaled anything in St. Petersburg. Several members of the British aristocracy made pilgrimages to Fifth Avenue, curious to see how the American cousins lived, often leaving impressed and slightly intimidated by the scale of wealth on display. Minor German princes, Italian counts, French marquises, all came to pay their respects and perhaps hope for financial assistance from this new American aristocracy. These visits required weeks of preparation, elaborate planning that fell primarily on Alice's shoulders. Special menus had to be designed to honor the guests and their national preferences. Entertainment programs had to be arranged, gifts had to be selected, and complex diplomatic protocols had to be observed. One misstep, one breach of etiquette, could create an international incident, or at least a damaging social scandal. Alice managed all of this with impressive skill and patience, studying books on protocol, consulting with diplomats, making sure every detail was perfect. Yet for all the glamour and glittering parties, for all the social triumphs and the constant stream of famous guests, Cornelius himself remained a somewhat reluctant participant in this social circus. He attended events because it was expected, because his position as head of the Vanderbilt family and chairman of the New York Central Railroad demanded it, because Alice needed him there to complete the picture of domestic harmony and family solidarity. But his true passion, his real obsession, was business, specifically the vast railroad empire that his family controlled and that he had dedicated his life to expanding and protecting. By the 1890s, he had become not just chairman, but the driving force behind the New York Central Railroad, one of the most powerful transportation companies in America, with thousands of miles of track, tens of thousands of employees, and annual revenues that exceeded the budgets of many states. He worked tirelessly, relentlessly, often 16 or 18 hours a day, 7 days a week except Sunday when religious observance forced him to rest. His days began before sunrise, often at 5 or 5:30 in the morning, when he would rise, dress with his valet's help, and go directly to his library to begin reading reports that had arrived by telegram overnight from railroad managers in Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, Albany, and dozens of other cities. He ate breakfast while reading, barely tasting his food, his mind already engaged with problems and opportunities. By 8 o'clock, he was either in his home office or heading to the railroad headquarters downtown, where he would spend the next 10 or 12 hours in meetings, negotiations, planning sessions, and decision-making that affected the lives of thousands of workers and the fortunes of millions of investors. He negotiated with rival railroad barons, men like J.P. Morgan and Edward Harriman, fighting constantly to protect the Vanderbilt monopoly on East Coast transportation, to prevent competitors from building parallel lines, to maintain the family's dominant position in an industry that was becoming more competitive and more cutthroat with every passing year. His days were filled with stress that would have broken weaker men, labor disputes that threatened to shut down entire sections of the network, negotiations with state legislatures over railroad regulations and taxes, battles with rival companies over access to lucrative routes, Financial crises that required immediate decisions about investments and expenditures. Safety issues when accidents occurred, and they occurred regularly in an era when railroad safety was still primitive. Every day brought new crises, new problems that required his attention and decision-making. Even at home in his magnificent mansion, surrounded by beauty and luxury, he was often working, reading financial reports in his library late into the night, answering urgent telegrams from agents across the country, planning strategy for the next business battle that was always just around the corner. The mansion was his castle, yes, the physical symbol of his success and his family's position. But the railroad was his kingdom, his real source of power and influence, the engine that generated the wealth that made everything else possible. And he ruled it with the same iron discipline and seriousness that had defined his entire life. The year 1893 marked perhaps the peak of the Vanderbilt family's social power, and the ball held that January became the stuff of legend, talked about for decades afterward, the standard against which all other society events would be measured. More than 1,000 guests attended, filling not just the ballroom but every room on the main floor, spilling out into the marble halls, crowding the grand staircase, even venturing into the usually private library and drawing rooms. The ballroom itself glowed with what seemed like supernatural light, hundreds of candles in the chandeliers supplemented by the new electric lights that had just been installed, creating an illumination that was brighter and more even than anything most guests had ever experienced. Women wore gowns that cost thousands of dollars each, dresses that had taken seamstresses weeks or months to create, covered with embroidery and beading and lace that shimmered as they moved. They dripped with jewels that caught the light as they danced, diamonds that had once belonged to European royalty, pearls that had taken decades to grow to their impressive size, colored gemstones that glowed like captured fire. Men in white tie and tails moved through the rooms with the confidence of those who owned the world, discussing business deals worth millions, political maneuvers that would shape the future of the country, and social strategies that would determine who rose and who fell in New York's merciless hierarchy. The orchestra in the gallery played waltzes and polkas, the music floating through the rooms, setting the tempo for dancers who moved with practiced grace across the polished parquet floor. Champagne flowed in rivers from bottles that cost more than most workers earned in a month. Servants in elaborate livery, specially made for the occasion, moved through the crowds with silver trays holding glasses and delicate appetizers. The New York Times devoted 3 full pages to describing the event the next day, listing every important guest, describing the most impressive costumes in elaborate detail, analyzing the social significance of who had attended and who had been excluded. For one night, for those magical hours, the Vanderbilt Mansion was the absolute center of the American universe, a place where power, beauty, and wealth converged in a display so lavish it seemed almost unreal, like something from a fairy tale or a dream. But behind the marble walls and glittering chandeliers, behind the social triumphs and business successes, shadows were gathering, invisible to the guests dancing in the ballroom but impossible to ignore for those who knew Cornelius well. The stress of managing the railroad empire, the endless pressure of maintaining the family's position, the constant battles with competitors, all of it was taking a terrible toll on his health. Friends noticed that he looked tired, that the lines on his face seemed to deepen with every passing month, that he moved with less energy than before. Alice noticed that he slept poorly, that he often woke in the middle of the night, his mind racing with problems that wouldn't let him rest. His doctors, whom he consulted reluctantly and only when Alice insisted, warned him that he was pushing himself too hard, that his body couldn't sustain this pace forever, that he needed to slow down, to delegate more responsibility, to take care of himself. But Cornelius couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, couldn't let go of control even for a moment. The railroad was his life, his identity, his purpose. Without it, He didn't know who he was or what his life meant. The first major crisis came in the spring of 1896, and it was sudden and devastating. Cornelius was in his office at the railroad headquarters downtown, meeting with several managers about an expansion plan for the Western lines. They were discussing routes and costs, looking at maps spread across his desk, when suddenly he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His left arm went limp. The left side of his face sagged. He tried to speak, but only incoherent sounds came out. The managers, terrified, called for help immediately. A doctor who had an office in the building was summoned and recognized the symptoms instantly. Cornelius had suffered a stroke, and it was a serious one. He was taken home by private carriage, carried up the grand staircase to his bedroom, where he would spend the next several weeks recovering or trying to recover. The stroke left him partially paralyzed on his left side, his left arm and leg weak and unresponsive. His speech was slurred, words coming out thick and difficult to understand. His face was asymmetrical, the left side drooping in a way that he found humiliating, that made him not want to see visitors or look in mirrors. The doctors were brought in, the best neurological specialists in New York, and they examined him thoroughly before delivering their verdict. Complete rest for months, possibly a year or more. No work, no stress, no business decisions. He needed to let his brain heal, to give his body time to recover whatever function it could. But Cornelius refused to accept this diagnosis, refused to believe that he couldn't work, that the railroad would have to function without him. Within days, against every medical recommendation, he was demanding that reports be brought to his bedroom, that managers come to visit him, that he be allowed to continue running the railroad from his bed. Alice watched helplessly as the man she loved pushed himself toward complete collapse, driven by an obsession he couldn't control and wouldn't acknowledge. She tried to convince him to step back, to let his younger brothers and cousins share the burden of management, to let professional managers make day-to-day decisions while he recovered. She brought in priests to talk to him about accepting God's will, about understanding that his health was more important than business. She even threatened to have the doctors declare him incompetent if he wouldn't listen to reason. But nothing worked. Cornelius was convinced that only he could protect the family's railroad empire, that any relaxation of his control would lead to disaster, that competitors were waiting for any sign of weakness to attack. Every day, he struggled out of bed, dressed with his valet's help, the process now taking much longer because of his paralyzed left side, and made his way slowly to his library to work. Every night, he returned to bed exhausted and in pain, his body weaker, but his mind still racing with problems and strategies and fears about what would happen if he let go. Over the next 3 years, Cornelius's health continued its steady, inexorable decline. He suffered additional minor strokes in 1897 and 1898, each one stealing a bit more of his strength, a bit more of his vitality, a bit more of the man he had been. By 1899, at age 55, he was largely confined to the mansion. The daily trip to the railroad office now impossible, the stairs becoming an obstacle that took him 10 minutes to climb with help. Walking became difficult and then nearly impossible without assistance. Speaking clearly became a constant struggle, his words coming out slurred and garbled, forcing listeners to lean close and ask him to repeat himself, which frustrated and humiliated him. The great social gatherings at the mansion became less frequent as Alice tried to shield him from the exhausting demands of entertaining, from the eyes of guests who would see his weakness and perhaps use it against the family. The ballroom fell silent more often, its golden walls reflecting only emptiness, its chandeliers dark, its polished floor no longer echoing with the sound of dancing feet. Alice tried desperately to maintain appearances, to pretend that everything was normal, that Cornelius was simply choosing to spend more time at home rather than being forced there by illness. She hosted smaller dinners and receptions, carefully curated gatherings of only the closest friends and family, people who could be trusted not to gossip about Cornelius's condition. But everyone in New York society could see the change, could sense that something had shifted, that the master of the greatest mansion in the city was fading. Rivals began to circle, sensing opportunity. Other society leaders began to assert themselves more boldly, no longer quite so deferential to the Vanderbilt name. The whispers started, quiet at first but growing louder. Cornelius was finished. The Vanderbilt era was ending. Perhaps it was time for new families to take their place at the top of the social pyramid. Cornelius knew what was happening, knew that his empire was slipping from his grasp despite his desperate efforts to hold on. He could feel his body betraying him, could feel his mind sometimes going foggy when he tried to focus on complex problems, could sense that he was losing the battle he had been fighting for 3 years. In his lucid moments, he worried constantly about what would happen to the railroad, to the family's fortune, to his wife and children, to everything he had worked so hard to build and protect. He tried to prepare his eldest son, Cornelius III, to take over, spending hours trying to explain the complexities of railroad management, the relationships with political figures, the ongoing negotiations with rivals. But he worried that his son wasn't ready, that no one could really understand the burden he had been carrying, that perhaps it had all been for nothing. On September 11, 1899, Cornelius spent his last day alive in the library of the Fifth Avenue Mansion, sitting in his favorite chair by the window, looking out over the street he had come to know so well. He couldn't work anymore, couldn't focus on the reports and telegrams that still arrived daily. Instead, he simply sat and looked, perhaps remembering better days, perhaps thinking about all he had accomplished and all he would never finish. That evening, he allowed his valet to help him to bed earlier than usual, telling Alice he was tired, more tired than he had ever been. She sat with him for hours, holding his hand, talking quietly about nothing important, just being present. Around midnight, he closed his eyes and seemed to fall asleep. By 2 a.m, he was gone. A blood clot, the doctor said later, probably from one of the earlier strokes, had finally reached his heart or brain and ended his struggle. The news of Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death spread across the country within hours. Telegraphed from New York to every major city, announced in special editions of newspapers that hit the streets before dawn. The front pages treated it as a national event, not just the death of a wealthy man, but the passing of an era. Obituaries praised his business acumen, his success in expanding the family's railroad empire, his philanthropic work, which had included substantial donations to hospitals, churches, and educational institutions. They noted his serious character, his religious devotion, his dedication to family. They mentioned, usually delicately, that he had worked himself to death, that the strain of managing such a vast empire had proven too much for even his strong constitution. Flags were lowered to half-staff along the thousands of miles of railroad lines he had controlled, from New York to Chicago, from Buffalo to Cleveland, a tribute visible to millions of Americans who depended on those railroads for their livelihoods and their mobility. His funeral at St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue was attended by thousands of people, so many that crowds spilled out onto the street, blocking traffic for blocks in every direction. Inside the church, every pew was filled with the most powerful men in America, fellow railroad barons who had been both allies and rivals. Politicians from New York and Washington who had benefited from his support and feared his opposition. Industrialists and financiers whose own empires intersected with the Vanderbilt interests. And society leaders from every prominent family in New York. The service was formal and traditional, with hymns and prayers and a eulogy that praised Cornelius's character and achievements without mentioning the controversies that had dogged the railroad industry, without acknowledging the labor disputes and safety issues and monopolistic practices that had made some people view him as a robber baron rather than a captain of industry. But the true mourning, the real grief, happened in the mansion itself after the funeral, when Alice and her 7 children gathered in the drawing room. Surrounded by all the luxury and beauty that Cornelius had created but could no longer enjoy, Alice was devastated, hollowed out by loss in a way that made her seem suddenly old, suddenly fragile. She was only 49 years old, still young by most measures, but she felt ancient, felt that the best part of her life was over. She was now a widow with 7 children, ranging from Cornelius III, who was 26 and married, down to Gladys, who was just 12 and still needed a mother's guidance. The mansion that had been their shared dream, the physical expression of their partnership and their ambition, now became her burden alone, a monument to what had been, a beautiful shell that reminded her every day of what she had lost. The first harsh reality she faced was the enormous cost of maintaining the mansion, a cost that suddenly became her sole responsibility to manage. Cornelius had left her an enormous fortune, tens of millions of dollars in stocks, bonds, real estate, and other investments, enough that she would never want for anything, that she could live in luxury for the rest of her life. But he had also left enormous expenses that consumed money at a rate that was truly staggering. The property taxes alone on the Fifth Avenue mansion consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars each year, more than most wealthy families earned in total income. The staff salaries for more than 40 full-time employees, plus the cost of feeding and housing them in the servants' quarters, ran into tens of thousands of dollars every month. Utilities, the coal for heating, the gas and electricity for lighting, the water for the elaborate bathrooms and the kitchens, all of it cost far more than most people could imagine. Maintenance and repairs were constant and expensive as the building aged and systems wore out and the harsh New York weather took its toll on the limestone facade. The mansion consumed wealth like a hungry beast, like a dragon that demanded constant feeding and would never be satisfied. Every month brought new expenses, new bills, new demands on her fortune, and unlike Cornelius, who had viewed these expenses as simply the cost of maintaining the family's position, and who had the railroad generating enormous income to cover them, Alice saw them as a burden, as money flowing out for a building that suddenly seemed far too large, far too empty, far too filled with memories that hurt to encounter around every corner. For a few years after Cornelius's death, she tried to continue the lifestyle they had built together. She hosted parties and dinners, maintained her position at the pinnacle of New York society, kept the mansion running exactly as it had during Cornelius's lifetime, a tribute to his memory and a determination not to let everything he had built slip away. She attended the opera, gave to charities, served on boards, and ensured her children were properly launched into society with all the advantages the Vanderbilt name could provide. But her heart wasn't in it anymore, couldn't be in it. The mansion felt wrong without Cornelius, felt too large and too empty despite being filled with furniture and art and servants. The rooms echoed with memories of what had been, and every corner reminded her of loss, of conversations they would never have again, of moments they had shared that could never be repeated. The library where he had spent so many evenings still smelled faintly of his tobacco, but the chair by the window where he had loved to sit was empty now, would always be empty. The dining room where they had hosted so many elaborate dinners seemed cavernous and cold when she dined there alone, or with just one or two of her children. The ballroom, that magnificent space where they had celebrated so many triumphs, seemed like a tomb, beautiful but dead, a monument to an era that had ended with Cornelius's final breath. At night, lying alone in her elaborate bedroom, she could hear the mansion settling and creaking, old wood and stone shifting as temperatures changed, and it sounded to her like the house itself was grieving, like the building missed its creator as much as she did. Meanwhile, outside the marble walls of the Vanderbilt mansion, the world was changing with a speed and thoroughness that made the Gilded Age seem suddenly like ancient history. The transformation was economic, social, political, and cultural, all happening simultaneously, all reinforcing each other in ways that would ultimately doom the mansion and everything it represented. The Gilded Age, that glorious period of unchecked capitalism and aristocratic excess that had reached its peak in the 1890s, was giving way to what would be called the Progressive Era. a time of reform and regulation, of questioning old assumptions and demanding new solutions to social problems that could no longer be ignored. Progressive reformers were demanding stronger regulations on big business, laws that would protect workers from exploitation and consumers from dangerous products. Labor unions were growing stronger every year, organizing strikes that sometimes shut down entire industries, demanding fair wages and decent working conditions, and an end to the 12 and 14-hour workdays that had been standard. The newspapers that had once fawned over the Vanderbilts and other wealthy families, that had devoted pages to describing their parties and their homes and their travels, now ran editorials questioning whether anyone should live in such extravagant luxury, while millions of workers struggled in poverty, living in crowded tenements without heat or running water, working dangerous jobs for wages that barely kept their families fed. Muckraking journalists were exposing the darker side of the railroad industry, writing about safety violations that killed workers regularly, about monopolistic practices that eliminated competition, about political corruption that allowed the railroads to write their own regulations. The public mood was shifting in ways that made people like the Vanderbilts uncomfortable, made them defensive about their wealth, uncertain about their place in a society that was questioning the very legitimacy of great fortunes. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had awakened a new sense of American nationalism and democratic pride, a feeling that European-style aristocracy, with its inherited titles and private palaces, didn't belong in the United States, that America should be different, should be a land of opportunity where success was earned through merit rather than inherited through birth. The massive mansions along Fifth Avenue, which had seemed so impressive and admirable just a decade earlier when they were being built, began to seem like embarrassing relics of a less enlightened time, like symbols of inequality that should make Americans ashamed rather than proud. The mood was captured by Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 and who spoke constantly about the need to regulate the trusts and break up monopolies, about the need for a square deal for every American, about the dangers of allowing too much wealth and power to concentrate in too few hands. The Vanderbilt children, Cornelius's 7 heirs, were also changing in ways that would have troubled their father if he had lived to see it. They were becoming less interested in maintaining their parents' lifestyle, less committed to the social rituals and business obligations that had defined the previous generation, more interested in pursuing their own desires and dreams, even when those conflicted with family expectations. Cornelius III, the eldest son and heir to the family leadership, had his own ideas about how to live, ideas that were more modern and less rigid than his father's had been. He cared about business and about maintaining the family fortune, yes, but he also had other interests: military technology, which he studied seriously and wrote about in technical journals, inventing, which led to several patents in his name, and a more casual approach to social obligations that sometimes scandalized the older generation. Reginald, the third son, preferred gambling and parties to business, spending money as fast as it came to him, caring more about having fun than about building anything lasting. Gertrude, the oldest daughter, became an artist and sculptor, serious about her work, eventually becoming a significant patron of the arts, more interested in creativity and culture than in maintaining social position. Alfred, the youngest son, joined the military and eventually went down with the Lusitania in 1915, dying a hero but dying young. Each of them was pulling away from the old ways in their own fashion, questioning whether the mansion and everything it represented was really worth preserving, whether the burden of maintaining this palace and this lifestyle was something they wanted to carry for the rest of their lives. They had all grown up surrounded by luxury so complete that they took it entirely for granted. The mansion that seemed so magnificent to visitors, that made grown men stop and stare in wonder, was simply home to them, as ordinary and unremarkable as any house in any neighborhood. They didn't marvel at the gold-leafed ballroom or the carved staircases or the art that filled every room. They saw it every day, walked past it without noticing, barely registered its existence. And perhaps because of that familiarity, because luxury had always been their normal, they didn't feel the same emotional attachment to the mansion that their parents had felt. It was just a building to them, a very large and very expensive building that consumed resources and required constant attention. The idea of selling it, of moving somewhere more practical, didn't fill them with the horror and grief it would have caused Cornelius. It seemed to them like a reasonable business decision, a practical response to changing times and changing needs. By 1905, Alice was having serious conversations with her financial advisors about the future of the Fifth Avenue mansion. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Maintaining the building was costing her fortune significantly more each year than any reasonable investment return could justify. If she were putting that money into stocks or bonds or real estate investments instead of into maintaining a single building, her wealth would be growing instead of shrinking. The financial logic was clear, even if the emotional logic was painful. Her advisors recommended that she consider alternatives, perhaps moving to a smaller residence in the city, perhaps spending more time at the family's other properties like the Breakers in Newport, perhaps even selling the Fifth Avenue mansion and using the proceeds to fund her other expenses and charitable interests. In 1908, after years of internal struggle and painful deliberation, Alice made her decision. She couldn't maintain the Fifth Avenue mansion any longer, couldn't bear the emotional weight of living there alone, couldn't justify the enormous expenses when the building no longer served its original purpose of housing the family and entertaining society. She decided to keep the Breakers in Newport, which had been built in the 1890s and which had become the true social center for the remaining Vanderbilts, who still cared about maintaining their position in society. The Newport Cottage, as they called it, though it was actually a massive palazzo-style mansion, was where the family gathered in summer, where society still congregated, where the old rituals still had meaning. But the New York mansion, Cornelius's dream, the palace he had built to last for centuries, would be passed to their eldest son, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, who was now 35 years old, married, and who had his own ideas about how to live and what the mansion should represent. The transfer of ownership should have been smooth and uneventful, a simple passing of property from mother to son, maintaining the mansion within the family as Cornelius had always intended. But it wasn't smooth at all. Because Cornelius III had done something years earlier that New York society considered not just questionable, but actually unforgivable, something that would haunt him and his wife for the rest of their lives and would ultimately contribute to the mansion's downfall. In 1896, while his father was already ill from his first stroke, Cornelius III had married Grace Wilson against his dying father's explicit wishes and over his mother's strong and vocal objections. The wedding had caused a scandal that shook the Vanderbilt family to its foundation and sent shockwaves through New York society. Grace Wilson was not, by the standards of old New York, an appropriate bride for a Vanderbilt heir. She came from a wealthy family, yes, but it was new wealth. Money made recently in business and banking rather than inherited through generations. The Wilsons were considered socially ambitious in ways that old families found vulgar, pushy in their desire to climb the social ladder, too obvious in their pursuit of status. Grace's sister had married into European nobility, which had helped the family's position somewhat. But it hadn't erased the taint of new money, the sense that the Wilsons weren't quite our kind of people, as the society matrons whispered behind their fans. When Cornelius III announced his intention to marry Grace, his father had been furious, seeing it as a betrayal of family standards, a lowering of the Vanderbilt name. His mother, Alice, had been even more upset, initially refusing to attend the wedding and cutting off communication with her son for several months afterward. The wedding went ahead anyway in February 1896, a relatively quiet affair given the circumstances, nothing like the grand society wedding that a Vanderbilt heir would normally have received. Alice eventually reconciled with her son, maternal love overcoming social disappointment, accepting that the marriage had happened and couldn't be undone. She came to respect and even like Grace in private, recognizing that her new daughter-in-law genuinely loved Cornelius III and worked hard to be a good wife. But the damage in society's eyes was done, permanently and irreparably. The invisible walls that had always opened automatically for anyone bearing the Vanderbilt name suddenly became barriers, polite but impenetrable. When Cornelius III and Grace took over the Fifth Avenue Mansion in 1908, when they moved into those gold-leafed rooms and tried to assume the social position that should have been automatically theirs, they discovered that society's memory was long and its judgment was harsh. They were never fully accepted by the old guard, the Knickerbocker families, and the older generation of wealthy families who still controlled access to the most exclusive social circles. Grace tried desperately to win society's approval, spending enormous sums on her wardrobe, hosting elaborate parties that followed every rule of etiquette with painful precision, cultivating relationships with powerful society matrons who might sponsor her ascent. She studied constantly, learning the complex rules that governed behavior, making sure she never made a social misstep that could be used against her. But the whispers never stopped, never faded, never lost their poison. She was always the outsider, always the woman who had married into the Vanderbilt name through ambition rather than being born to it, always slightly suspect, never quite belonging. Invitations that should have been automatic, that should have arrived as a matter of course for the residents of the Vanderbilt Mansion, were suddenly not forthcoming. Events that should have included them mysteriously forgot to send notices, or sent them so late that attendance became awkward. It was all very subtle and very polite, as social cruelty among the upper classes always was, but it was devastating nonetheless. The mansion that had been built specifically to be the center of New York society, that had hosted presidents and princes, was slowly being isolated, marginalized, turned into a magnificent but increasingly irrelevant monument to a family that society had decided to punish for the crime of marrying for love rather than for strategic social advantage. Cornelius III himself seemed less concerned with social acceptance than his wife was, less wounded by the slights and exclusions. He had inherited not just his grandfather's business sense, but also a more practical, modern sensibility that recognized the world was changing faster than society's rules could keep up. He understood that the age of private palaces was ending, that new values and new economics were making buildings like the Fifth Avenue Mansion unsustainable, that fighting against these changes was futile and probably foolish. He continued to work in the family businesses, managing investments and railroad holdings, but he also pursued other interests that would have seemed eccentric to his father's generation. He invented things, holding multiple patents for improvements to railroad equipment and military technology. He wrote articles about military affairs and strategy for professional journals. He was less interested in maintaining appearances for their own sake than in adapting to new realities that wouldn't be denied. And one of those new realities was becoming impossible to ignore or deny. The mansion was an enormous financial burden that provided very little real value in return. By the 1910s, the costs of maintaining the building had become truly crushing, even for Vanderbilt wealth. Property taxes kept rising steadily as New York City grew, and its government needed more revenue to provide services to millions of new residents. The mansion sat on land that was becoming more valuable every year, and tax assessments reflected that increasing value. The building itself required constant and increasingly expensive repairs. The old limestone facade was weathering badly in New York's harsh climate, the freeze-thaw cycles of winter causing cracks and deterioration that required skilled stonemasons to repair. Plaster was cracking throughout the interior as the building settled and shifted on its foundation. The mechanical systems, which had been cutting edge in the 1880s, were now becoming outdated, inefficient, and prone to failure. The heating system alone, which relied on dozens of coal-fired boilers in the basement, required multiple full-time workers just to keep it running through the winter months. Tons of coal had to be purchased and stored, carried down to the basement by workers whose labor was becoming more expensive as unions grew stronger and workers demanded better wages. The plumbing, revolutionary when it was installed, was now 30 years old and showing its age, with pipes that leaked and fixtures that failed, requiring constant repairs by specialized plumbers. The electrical system, which had been added in the 1890s as a modern improvement, was becoming dangerous, with outdated wiring that was a genuine fire hazard and that needed to be completely replaced at enormous expense. Every year brought new problems, new systems that failed and needed replacement, new expenses that consumed capital without providing any return, except the privilege of continuing to live in an increasingly obsolete building. The final blow to the mansion's viability came from an unexpected direction: the transformation of Fifth Avenue itself and the complete reimagining of what that street should be. By the 1920s, Fifth Avenue was no longer the quiet residential boulevard it had been in the 1880s when the mansion was built. It was rapidly becoming the premier commercial corridor in America, perhaps in the entire world. Lined with department stores that catered to the growing middle class, office buildings that housed the headquarters of major corporations, luxury shops that sold goods from around the globe, and hotels that welcomed travelers with money to spend. The wealthy families who had built their palaces there in the 1880s and 1890s, who had transformed Fifth Avenue into America's most prestigious address, were now abandoning the street in droves, fleeing to quieter neighborhoods uptown, or to the new luxury apartment buildings on Park Avenue that offered modern conveniences without the crushing burden of maintaining huge private houses. The exodus had started slowly around 1910, but accelerated dramatically after World War I ended in 1918. The Astor Mansion was sold and demolished. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion, built by Cornelius's cousin, was put on the market. The Mrs. Astor Mansion, for decades the undisputed center of New York society, was torn down to make way for commercial development. One by one, the great palaces were falling, replaced by buildings that generated revenue instead of consuming it, by structures that served hundreds or thousands of people instead of just one family. The Dakota on Central Park West, the Ansonia on Broadway, and other luxury apartment buildings were offering wealthy New Yorkers a new way to live, one that combined elegance and prestige with modern efficiency. These buildings had elevators so you didn't have to climb stairs, central heating that worked reliably without requiring a staff to maintain it, security provided by doormen and building management, and services like cleaning and maintenance that were included in the monthly charges. You could live in luxury without employing dozens of servants, without worrying about property taxes and repairs, without the constant pressure of maintaining a massive building that demanded attention every single day. Real estate developers, always alert to opportunity and shifting fortunes, circled the remaining Fifth Avenue mansions like sharks that smelled blood in the water. They made offers that were impossible to ignore, astronomical sums for the land alone, with the clear and explicit understanding that the buildings would be demolished immediately, torn down and carted away like the obsolete relics they had become. The land beneath the Vanderbilt Mansion, that entire city block at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, was worth far more than the building itself, exponentially more. A modern commercial building on that corner, a steel-framed skyscraper with multiple floors of rentable space, could generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual rent, money that flowed in reliably year after year, decade after decade. The mansion just consumed money, provided nothing but prestige, and prestige was no longer worth what it had once been. Couldn't pay bills or generate returns, or justify the massive capital investment required to maintain it. Cornelius III and Grace faced an impossible choice that kept them awake at night, that they debated endlessly in private, that divided their own family and friends. They could pour millions of dollars they could never recover into maintaining a building they didn't really need. Fighting against the tide of economic logic and social change, preserving their legacy at the cost of their financial future. Or they could accept reality, acknowledge that the world had changed and they needed to change with it. Sell to developers who would pay handsomely for the privilege of destroying the mansion, and use that money for something more practical, more sustainable, more aligned with how wealthy people actually wanted to live in the 20th century. It was a choice between sentiment and sense, between honoring the past and embracing the future, between preserving a monument to Cornelius II's dream and accepting that the dream had become a burden that couldn't be carried any longer. The decision was made harder by public opinion, which was divided and passionate on both sides. Preservationists argued that the mansion was a historical treasure, an architectural masterpiece that represented the peak of Gilded Age achievement, something that should be saved for future generations who would want to understand how the wealthy had lived in that era. They wrote letters to newspapers, organized protests, circulated petitions demanding that the city designate the mansion as a landmark and prevent its destruction. They argued that New York was destroying its own history, erasing the physical evidence of its past in a short-sighted pursuit of profit, that future generations would curse them for allowing such beauty to be destroyed. But others argued just as passionately that private palaces had no place in a democratic society, that buildings requiring such vast resources to maintain were obscene when millions lived in poverty, that the mansion represented values America should reject rather than preserve. They wrote their own letters pointing out that the land could be used more productively, that a department store would employ hundreds of people and serve thousands of customers, that progress required letting go of the past, even when the past was beautiful. In 1925, after years of agonizing deliberation, after countless sleepless nights and difficult family meetings, after consulting with financial advisors and architects and historians, Cornelius III and Grace made their final decision. The mansion would be sold to a real estate development company called Frederick Brown, which planned to demolish it immediately and build a modern department store on the site. The announcement was made in a brief statement to the press in early 1926, and it detonated like a bomb in New York society and in newspapers across the country. The headlines screamed the news: Vanderbilt Mansion to be demolished, end of an era on Fifth Avenue. Palace makes way for progress. Editorial writers immediately took sides, some praising the decision as pragmatic and forward-thinking, others condemning it as cultural vandalism and the destruction of irreplaceable heritage. Letters to editors poured in by the hundreds, revealing how deeply divided Americans were about what the mansion represented and whether its destruction was loss or liberation. When reporters asked Cornelius III as to explain the decision, to justify destroying his father's monument, he gave them a statement that was cold, pragmatic, and completely honest in its assessment of reality. The age of private palaces is over. Fifth Avenue is no longer a residential street. New York is a city of business now, not a city of estates. We must adapt to new realities or be left behind, living in the past while the world moves forward without us. It was a practical statement, the words of a businessman explaining a business decision, but it also revealed something deeper and more significant. The Vanderbilts themselves, the family that had built the palace, no longer believed in the dream it represented. They had moved on, investing in smaller homes that were easier to maintain, in businesses that generated income rather than consuming it, in a future that had no room for 130-room mansions requiring armies of servants to maintain. The emotional attachment that Cornelius II had felt, the belief that the mansion would stand for centuries as a monument to the family name, had died with him. His children and grandchildren saw it differently, saw it as a beautiful but impractical burden, a relic of a bygone era that needed to be released. The demolition began in January 1927, and it would prove to be a massive undertaking that took nearly 18 months to complete. Professional wrecking crews arrived with sledgehammers, crowbars, ropes, and pulleys, and eventually small explosive charges to bring down the most stubborn walls. The process was methodical and brutally efficient. They started at the top of the building, carefully removing the slate roof tile by tile, salvaging what they could sell to other builders or collectors who wanted a piece of Vanderbilt history. Each slate was numbered and cataloged before being carried down and loaded onto trucks. Then came the towers, those dramatic structures that had made the mansion visible from blocks away, that had given it the appearance of a French chateau. The ornate dormers that broke the roofline were dismantled piece by piece. The carved limestone details that had taken craftsmen weeks or months to create, the elaborate window surrounds and decorative panels and sculptural elements, were carefully removed when possible, sold to collectors and museums, or simply destroyed when they were too damaged or too difficult to salvage. Each piece of the building came down in clouds of dust that hung over Fifth Avenue, like smoke from a battlefield, in crashes of falling stone that echoed through the neighborhood like artillery fire, in the constant background noise of hammers and saws and men shouting instructions to each other. The sound of demolition became the soundtrack of that corner for months, a constant reminder that something was ending, that the past was being physically dismantled and carried away. Crowds gathered daily on Fifth Avenue to watch the destruction, creating such congestion that police had to direct traffic around them, establish barriers to keep spectators at a safe distance from falling debris. The crowds revealed the deep fascination Americans had with the mansion's fate, the way its destruction seemed to symbolize larger changes happening in society, the transition from one era to another, from Gilded Age excess to modern pragmatism. The reactions of the spectators were as divided as the editorial opinions had been. Older New Yorkers, people who remembered the Gilded Age and had perhaps attended parties in the mansion during its glory days, stood with tears running down their faces, mourning the loss of something beautiful and irreplaceable. They talked about balls they had attended, dinners they had enjoyed, the sense of wonder they had felt walking into that great hall for the first time. They saw the demolition as a tragedy, an act of cultural vandalism that destroyed part of New York's identity, that erased a landmark future generations would want to see. Some brought cameras, taking photographs to document what was being lost, creating visual records that would become precious historical documents. Others just stood and watched in silence, bearing witness to the end of an era they had lived through and would now outlive. Younger people, those who had grown up after the Gilded Age ended, tended to see things very differently. They saw progress, the old making way for the new, the future replacing the past in the natural cycle that defined American life. They argued that private palaces were embarrassing relics of an undemocratic age, monuments to inequality that should make Americans ashamed rather than proud. They pointed out that the mansion had been used by just one family while thousands passed by outside every day, that the land could serve more people and do more good as a store that would employ hundreds and serve thousands. They saw the demolition not as loss, but as liberation. New York finally freeing itself from an embarrassing past and embracing a more egalitarian future. Some even cheered when particularly large sections of the building came crashing down, celebrating what they viewed as the death of aristocracy and the triumph of democracy. Newspapers ran daily updates on the demolition's progress, with photographers documenting each stage of the destruction. The images were haunting and powerful. The mansion with its roof gone, its interior exposed to the sky like a body opened on an operating table. Walls standing alone with nothing to support them. Rooms visible from the street that had always been hidden behind stone facades. The golden ballroom stripped of its glory and reduced to bare plaster and broken beams. The photographs told a story of inexorable destruction, of beauty being methodically erased, and they ran alongside articles that continued to debate what it all meant. Editorial writers never stopped arguing about whether this was progress or vandalism, necessary evolution or tragic loss, practical economics or cultural suicide. The arguments raged in print and in cafes and living rooms across the city, revealing how uncertain Americans were about their own values, about what should be preserved and what should be discarded, about whether the past deserved reverence or rejection. Inside the mansion, while the exterior was being demolished, other workers moved through the interior, stripping it bare, salvaging everything that had value or might have value to collectors and museums. The process was like an autopsy performed on a civilization, each layer revealing something about how the wealthy had lived and what they had valued. The gold leaf from the ballroom walls was carefully removed, scraped away in thin sheets that were melted down and sold. The precious metal recovered even as the beauty it had created was destroyed. The carved oak paneling from the dining room and library, those elaborate panels showing mythological scenes and medieval battles, were carefully removed intact and sold to wealthy buyers who installed them in their own homes and private clubs, fragmenting the mansion's interior and scattering it across the country. A businessman in Chicago bought several panels for his private library. A gentleman's club in Boston acquired the dining room paneling. A mansion in Philadelphia got pieces of the drawing room. The marble fireplaces, each one unique, each one a work of art carved from Italian marble by craftsmen whose names were lost to time, were removed and sold individually to anyone willing to pay for a piece of Vanderbilt history. Some went to museums, others to wealthy collectors, still others to hotels and office buildings that wanted a touch of grandeur. The crystal chandeliers, those massive creations that had illuminated so many glittering parties, were dismantled with painstaking care, each crystal prism wrapped individually, each metal armature cataloged and numbered so they could theoretically be reassembled elsewhere. Some were eventually reinstalled in other buildings. Others were broken up and sold piece by piece to people who wanted fragments of chandeliers that had once lit presidential visits and society balls. The stained glass windows, masterpieces commissioned from European artists decades earlier, were removed intact when possible and sold to churches, libraries, and private collectors who appreciated their beauty even when divorced from their original context. Even the marble from the floors and walls was salvaged rather than simply discarded. Workers broke it into manageable pieces, sorted it by quality and color, and sold it to contractors who would use it in other construction projects. Nothing was wasted. Everything that had value was extracted and sold, the mansion being reduced to its component parts like an animal being butchered. Every piece used, nothing left behind except dust and rubble and broken memories. The great central staircase, that magnificent curved structure of carved oak that had taken craftsmen 6 months to build, that had been photographed hundreds of times, that had been walked by presidents and princes and society queens, was dismantled piece by piece over several days. But unlike the other salvaged elements, the staircase couldn't be saved intact. It was too large, too complex, too deeply integrated into the building structure. Workers broke it apart, saving some of the more ornately carved sections but destroying most of it, reducing 6 months of skilled craftsmanship to firewood and scrap in just a few days. The silk wall coverings in the drawing room and Alice's bedroom, fragile and damaged after 40 years of exposure to sunlight and air, and the subtle decay that affects all organic materials, were torn away and discarded. They were too delicate to salvage, too fragile to move, and their beauty existed only in their original context. Carefully lit and maintained, removed from that context, they were just old cloth, faded and stained and worthless. The parquet floors, those intricate patterns of different colored woods that had taken weeks to install, each piece cut and fitted by hand to create geometric designs, were ripped up in hours. the wood broken and discarded. The patterns that had taken such skill to create destroyed without thought or ceremony. Room by room, floor by floor, the mansion was unmade, systematically taken apart and reduced to salvage and rubble and memory. The process brutal and efficient, and somehow deeply sad even to the workers who had never seen the mansion in its glory. By the spring of 1928, less than 18 months after demolition had begun, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion was completely gone, erased from the physical landscape of New York as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Not a single stone remained in its original place. The entire city block had been cleared, scraped down to bare ground, leveled and ready for whatever would come next. The site looked like a missing tooth in a smile, an empty space where something important had been, the surrounding buildings suddenly exposed in ways they never had been before, their side walls visible that had always been hidden, their proportions looking wrong now that the mansion no longer anchored the corner. It was as if the building had never existed, as if the decades of life lived there, the parties and dinners and balls, the births and deaths and marriages, the triumphs and tragedies that had unfolded in those rooms, had all been erased in clouds of dust and the crash of falling stone, leaving nothing behind but photographs and memories that would fade as the people who held them died. What came next, what replaced the Vanderbilt Mansion on that prestigious corner, was Bergdorf Goodman, a luxury department store that would become a New York institution in its own right, that would define that corner for the next century. The building, designed by architects Bushman and Kahn, was sleek and modern. Everything the old mansion wasn't. It was built in the Art Deco style that defined the late 1920s and captured the spirit of a new age, with clean geometric lines, large plate glass display windows that glowed with electric light day and night, and an interior filled with open space and modern conveniences that made shopping a pleasure rather than a chore. The building had elevators that whisked customers between floors at speeds that would have terrified earlier generations. It had electric escalators, a relatively new invention that carried shoppers upward in comfort and style. The lighting was bright and even, powered by modern electrical systems, not gas, creating an environment where colors looked true and merchandise could be properly evaluated. Climate control kept the interior comfortable year-round, warm in winter and cool in summer, using mechanical systems that represented the latest in building technology. It was everything the old mansion wasn't: practical and profitable and efficient, designed to serve thousands of customers rather than one family, built to generate revenue rather than consume it, oriented toward the future rather than the past. The irony wasn't lost on observers and social commentators who wrote about the transformation. The temple of private exclusivity, where entry had required the right family name and careful social connections, where invitations were more precious than gold, had been replaced by a temple of public consumption, where anyone with money or credit could walk through the doors and be welcomed, where success was measured in sales rather than social position. The Vanderbilt Mansion had been for the very few, perhaps a few hundred families in all of New York who met the strict requirements for social acceptance. Bergdorf Goodman was for the many, or at least for the growing middle class that had disposable income and wanted to spend it on luxury goods. Anyone who could afford their prices, which were still substantial but far more democratic than a private ball. In a strange way that philosophers and historians would debate for decades afterward, the transformation was a perfect symbol of America's evolution from Gilded Age aristocracy to 20th century consumer democracy. From a society organized around inherited status to one organized around earned wealth and purchased goods. The age of private palaces, of families who ruled like royalty and built monuments to their own glory, had given way to the age of shopping and consumption, where identity was expressed through what you bought rather than who your parents were, where social position could be purchased rather than inherited. The change represented both gain and loss, progress and decline, depending on your perspective and your values. Americans had gained accessibility and efficiency and a more democratic distribution of luxury. But they had lost something too. The belief that individuals could create something permanent and beautiful that would outlast them. The sense that private vision could produce public benefit. The understanding that beauty and grandeur had value beyond their economic utility. Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's widow, the woman who had presided over the mansion during its golden age, never saw its demolition. She had died in 1934 at the breakers in Newport, passing away peacefully at age 89, having lived long enough to know the mansion would be destroyed, but not having to witness the actual demolition spared that final grief. In her final years, she had retreated from society almost entirely, no longer able or willing to maintain the demanding social schedule that had defined her middle years. Surrounding herself with children and grandchildren and the few old friends who remained from earlier decades, most of her contemporaries having died or withdrawn from public life. The women who had ruled New York society alongside her in the 1890s, who had set fashion and determined who was in and who was out, who had wielded social power like queens, were gone now, dead or too old to matter anymore. Their influence evaporated, their names mostly forgotten except by historians. The world had changed so completely, so fundamentally, that Alice barely recognized it. The values she had been raised with, the certainties that had structured her entire life, no longer applied. Young women bobbed their hair and wore short skirts and smoked cigarettes in public, behavior that would have been scandalous in her youth but was now considered fashionable. Jazz music blared from radios, its syncopated rhythms replacing the waltzes she had danced to. Cars were everywhere, belching smoke and noise, replacing the horse-drawn carriages that had moved at a more civilized pace. The world moved faster now, talked louder, cared less about rules and traditions and the careful social choreography that had once determined everything. Friends who visited her at the breakers in those final years said she never spoke about the loss of the Fifth Avenue mansion, that she refused to discuss it, changed the subject whenever someone brought it up. Perhaps it was too painful to talk about, the memories too precious to share with people who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand what had been lost. Perhaps she understood what her son had understood, that holding on to the past was impossible, that time swept everything away eventually, no matter how beautiful or how carefully built. She was buried beside Cornelius in the family mausoleum on Staten Island, their graves marked with simple stones that gave no hint of the palace they had built or the empire they had commanded. And with her passing, the last direct connection to the mansion's golden age disappeared forever. The last person who had lived through those years and could describe them from personal memory. Cornelius Vanderbilt III lived until 1942, surviving long enough to see America transformed not just by the Great Depression, but also by World War II. Living long enough to see the world his father had known completely vanish, replaced by something his grandfather wouldn't have recognized or understood. He never built another palace or anything remotely resembling one, having learned perhaps that such monuments were unsustainable, that they represented values that couldn't survive in a democratic society. Instead, he lived in comfortable but relatively modest homes by Vanderbilt standards, a Fifth Avenue apartment and a country house in upstate New York, places that provided comfort and convenience without requiring armies of servants or consuming fortunes in maintenance. He invested in new industries and technologies rather than building monuments to himself, trying to adapt the family fortune to new economic realities rather than clinging to old business models that were becoming obsolete. He served in the military during World War I, earning respect for his service rather than his name, proving that he was more than just a wealthy heir. He invented things, held multiple patents for improvements to military equipment and communication technology, making real contributions to fields that interested him. He wrote articles about military affairs and strategy for professional journals, becoming recognized as a legitimate expert rather than just a dilettante. He gave occasional interviews about the old mansion, and reporters always asked about it, always wanted to know about the decision to demolish it, whether he regretted destroying his father's monument. He always spoke practically about the economics and the changing times, explaining that maintaining the building had become impossible, that the world had moved on, that clinging to the past would have been foolish and ultimately futile. But those who knew him well, family members and close friends who saw him in private moments, said he sometimes grew wistful when the topic came up, that his voice would soften and his eyes would get a faraway look, as if even he, the man who had signed the demolition order, felt some regret about erasing his father's dream. Late at night, they said, especially as he grew older and closer to his own death, he would sometimes talk about the mansion in ways he never did publicly, remembering parties and dinners from his childhood, his father working in the library while he played nearby, his mother's drawing room filled with society ladies, the grand staircase where he had raised his siblings, the servants who had raised him alongside his parents, the smell of flowers in the great hall, the sound of orchestras playing in the ballroom, the feeling of wonder he had felt as a child walking through rooms that seemed designed for giants. The memories were bittersweet, tinged with loss but also with acceptance and a certain peace. The mansion had been magnificent, beautiful, a testament to his father's ambition and his family's power. But it had also been unsustainable, a dream that couldn't survive in the world that emerged after World War I, a relic of an age that had ended as completely as if it had been centuries ago rather than just decades. The decision to demolish it had been painful but correct, he believed. The only rational choice available, given the circumstances. Sometimes, he said, you had to let go of beautiful things, had to accept that nothing lasted forever, that even monuments built in stone eventually crumbled to dust. Today, more than 95 years after the mansion's demolition, nothing physical remains of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion except scattered fragments in museums and private collections, pieces of a puzzle that can never be reassembled, evidence of something that once existed but exists no longer. The Bergdorf Goodman building still stands on the same corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, though it has been remodeled and expanded several times over the decades, updated to meet changing retail needs and aesthetic preferences. Shoppers walk every day across the ground where the great ballroom once stood, where 1,200 guests danced under crystal chandeliers and gold-leafed ceilings, where society queens held court and determined who would rise and who would fall in New York's rigid social hierarchy, completely unaware of what existed there before, completely ignorant of the history beneath their feet. There are no plaques or historical markers on that corner, nothing to indicate that the largest private residence in New York history once occupied that space, nothing to tell tourists and shoppers that they're standing on ground where presidents and princes once gathered, where the most powerful families in America competed for social supremacy, where an entire way of life reached its peak before crashing down. The city has no institutional memory of the mansion, has moved on completely, its attention focused on the future rather than the past. The tourists who crowd that corner every day, taking photographs of the store windows and the traffic and the Manhattan skyline, have no idea they're standing on consecrated ground, on a site where dreams were born and died, where history was made and then erased. The mansion exists now only in photographs, surprisingly few for such an important building, and most of them formal architectural images that show the building's grandeur but not its life, not the people who lived there or the events that unfolded in those rooms. There are architectural drawings preserved in libraries and archives, detailed blueprints showing floor plans and elevations, technical documents that describe the building structure but not its soul. There are scattered memories recorded in diaries and letters, personal accounts from people who attended parties there or worked as servants, fragments of experience that historians have pieced together to create a more complete picture. Museums hold physical fragments. A carved wooden panel from the library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, its intricate carvings of mythological scenes still impressive, even divorced from their original context. A section of the ballroom's gold-leafed molding at the Museum of the City of New York. still glowing with the same golden light that once illuminated society balls. One of the original chandeliers at a mansion in Philadelphia, where it hangs in an entrance hall, beautiful but somehow sad, like a displaced refugee from a lost world. But these fragments, as precious as they are to historians and as carefully as they're preserved, tell only part of the story, give only a hint of what was lost. They can't convey the scale, the overwhelming sense of grandeur that visitors felt when they walked through those doors for the first time and found themselves in spaces designed to inspire awe. They can't recreate the atmosphere, the sounds of orchestras playing and guests laughing and champagne corks popping, the smells of flowers and perfume and wood smoke from the fireplaces, the feeling of excitement and possibility that filled those rooms during the mansion's golden age. They're like broken pieces of pottery from an ancient civilization, interesting to scholars, but impossible for ordinary people to truly understand or fully appreciate. Archaeological evidence of a world that's gone and can never be reconstructed. Yet the story of the Vanderbilt Mansion matters today, perhaps matters more now than it did when the building still stood, because it tells us something essential and true about American culture, about our complicated and often contradictory relationship with wealth, with permanence, with legacy and memory. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built his palace believing it would last for generations, perhaps for centuries, that it would stand as an eternal monument to his family's achievement and power. He wanted to create something that would outlast his own life, that would keep the Vanderbilt name alive and respected long after he was gone. He spared no expense in the construction, employing hundreds of workers, importing the finest materials from around the world, hiring the best architects and craftsmen available. He built with limestone that would last for centuries, with techniques proven over millennia of architectural evolution. He created something truly magnificent, a building that rivaled the great European palaces in scale, in beauty, and artistic achievement that represented the very peak of what American wealth could accomplish in the Gilded Age. And it lasted 45 years. Less than half a century, less than a single human lifetime in an era when people regularly lived to 70 or 80. His own children, the next generation of Vanderbilts, were the ones who ordered its destruction, who signed the demolition contracts, who stood on Fifth Avenue and watched as wrecking balls smashed into walls their father had built, not out of malice or disrespect, but out of simple practical necessity. The dream had become a burden too heavy to carry. The monument had become a liability that consumed wealth without generating value. The palace had become unsustainable in a world that no longer believed in private palaces, that had moved on to new values and new ways of living that left no room for 130-room mansions requiring armies of servants. This is the fundamental paradox at the heart of the Gilded Age, the contradiction that doomed all its palaces and ultimately discredited its values. The men who built these monuments believed they were creating dynasties, permanent aristocracies that would rule America for generations or centuries, families whose names would be spoken with reverence long after they were gone. But America has never been truly comfortable with aristocracy, has never fully accepted the idea that some families should rule simply because of their birth. We admire success and celebrate achievement, yes. We respect people who build empires from nothing through hard work and innovation and vision. But we're deeply suspicious of inherited privilege, of families who wield power generation after generation without having to earn it anew. We celebrate wealth when it's earned through effort and merit, but we resent it when it becomes dynasties that pass power from parent to child without regard to capability or achievement. The Vanderbilt Mansion, like all the Gilded Age palaces that once lined Fifth Avenue, was doomed from the start, not because it was poorly built or badly designed, but because it represented ideas that fundamentally contradicted core American values. Democracy doesn't have room for private palaces where one family lives like royalty. Equality doesn't coexist comfortably with 130-room mansions that require 40 servants while millions of workers struggle in poverty. Progress doesn't stop to preserve monuments to individual egos, no matter how impressive those monuments might be, no matter how much beauty they contain. The mansion had to fall because America had to move forward, had to evolve beyond the values of the Gilded Age, had to become something closer to the democratic ideal it had always claimed to represent. Perhaps this was necessary. Perhaps the destruction of these palaces was required for America to become a more just and equitable society, to shed the pretensions of aristocracy and embrace a more egalitarian future. The money that might have been spent maintaining private palaces went instead to other purposes. Businesses that employed thousands, investments that generated wealth for shareholders, philanthropy that built universities, and hospitals and museums that served millions. The land they had occupied became commercial space that generated economic activity and jobs. The Vanderbilts themselves, after abandoning their palaces, became major philanthropists whose donations shaped American higher education and culture. Perhaps this represented a better use of wealth than maintaining monuments to themselves. Perhaps society benefited more from their charitable giving than it ever did from their lavish parties. But perhaps we also lost something valuable in the process, something that can never be fully recovered or replaced. Not the buildings themselves exactly, not the physical structures of stone and marble and gold, but what they represented, the belief that individuals could create something permanent and beautiful that would outlast them, the understanding that private vision could produce public beauty, the sense that grandeur and magnificence had value beyond their economic utility, that inspiring awe was itself a worthwhile goal. The Vanderbilt Mansion was excessive, yes, and wasteful by any reasonable standard, built with resources that could have been used for countless other purposes. But it was also magnificent, breathtaking, a work of art on a scale that few people have ever attempted. Walking through those rooms, standing in that ballroom, climbing that grand staircase must have been a transcendent experience for anyone who experienced it. A reminder that human beings were capable of creating beauty that lifted the spirit and expanded the imagination, that reached for something beyond the merely practical and utilitarian. We have efficiency now, practicality, democracy, equality. We have buildings that serve thousands instead of one family, cities where wealth is more broadly distributed, a society where success is more merit-based and less dependent on birth. These are genuine achievements, real progress that shouldn't be dismissed or minimized. But do we have grandeur? Do we have beauty that takes your breath away and makes you believe in something larger than yourself? Do we build anything today with the same ambition and vision that created the Vanderbilt Mansion, with the same commitment to excellence and refusal to compromise? These are uncomfortable questions without easy answers, questions that each generation must grapple with and answer for itself, questions about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of our values. What we know for certain, what history teaches us beyond doubt, is this: Cornelius Vanderbilt II spent his entire adult life building an empire and creating a monument to house it and represent it to the world. He worked himself to death at age 55, driven by the same relentless ambition that had defined 3 generations of his family, driven by an obsession he couldn't control or moderate even when it was killing him. He created something magnificent, a palace that set the standard for American luxury and inspired awe in everyone who saw it, that represented the absolute peak of what Gilded Age wealth could achieve. He filled it with the finest art and furniture that money could buy, with objects of beauty collected from around the world, with craftsmanship that took years to create and centuries to perfect. He intended it to last forever, to stand for generations or centuries as a permanent monument to the Vanderbilt name, to be the home of his descendants for as long as the family endured. And within 50 years of his death, it was completely erased, demolished, and replaced by a department store where strangers shop for clothes and accessories. walking unknowingly over ground where presidents and princes once gathered, where America's elite once danced and dined and dreamed of permanence in a world where nothing is truly permanent. The stones he built with such care have been scattered or crushed, the gold leaf scraped away and melted down to us. The marble broken and reused, the beauty that took decades to create destroyed in months and forgotten in years. Standing on that corner today, on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, surrounded by the noise and chaos of modern Manhattan, the honking taxis and chattering crowds and electronic billboards flashing their endless advertisements, you might pause for a moment and try to imagine it. Try to resurrect it in your mind's eye through an act of historical imagination. Close your eyes and picture the limestone towers rising impossibly high above you, their details sharp against the blue sky, their presence dominating everything around them. See the massive carved doorway, its scale designed to make visitors feel small and awestruck, opening to reveal a marble vestibule that glowed with reflected light. Hear the sound of horse-drawn carriages pulling up to that entrance, their wheels clattering on cobblestones, their horses snorting and stamping while liveried footmen rush to open doors and help guests alight. Watch elegantly dressed women stepping down from those carriages, their gowns rustling with layers of silk and satin, their jewels catching the gaslight from the street lamps, their voices carrying across the evening air an excited conversation. See men in formal evening wear, white tie and tails, top hats and walking sticks, moving with the confidence of those who owned the world and knew it. Follow them up the marble steps, through those massive doors, and into the great hall where your imagination must somehow capture the overwhelming scale of that space. The grand staircase spiraling upward through 3 floors, its carved oak banister gleaming like polished glass, each newel post a sculpture in itself. The ceiling soaring above, covered in plasterwork so elaborate it looked like lace made of cream and gold, with crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, their thousands of prisms catching and multiplying the light from hundreds of candles and gas jets. Walk in your mind through the drawing room where Alice once held court, its walls covered in crimson silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight. French furniture arranged in conversation groups, paintings in gilded frames showing pastoral scenes and aristocratic portraits. Move through the library where Cornelius spent his evenings, surrounded by thousands of leather-bound volumes, sitting at his massive desk by the window, reading business reports while the city moved below him. Climb the stairs to the ballroom, that magnificent space that stretched nearly 60 feet in every direction, its walls covered in gold leaf that shimmered like water when the light hit it, its chandeliers blazing like captured stars, an orchestra playing in the gallery while 1,200 guests danced and laughed and celebrated their position at the top of American society. Try to hear the music floating through those spaces, waltzes and polkas played by professional musicians who had trained for decades to achieve perfection. Try to smell the flowers that filled every room, roses and orchids and lilies imported from greenhouses and changed daily by servants you never saw. Try to feel the excitement and possibility that filled the air during parties when power and beauty and wealth converged in ways that seemed to make anything possible. Try to imagine what it felt like to be there, to be part of that world even for an evening, to experience luxury and grandeur on a scale that most people could barely conceive. And then open your eyes. Open them to the reality of today, to the department store and the traffic and the crowds of tourists taking selfies. It's all gone. Every bit of it. Just sidewalks and storefronts and the relentless forward motion of a city that never looks back. That has no time for nostalgia or regret or mourning. The past is past. The mansion is demolished. The people who built it, who lived in it, who danced in its ballroom and dined at its table and believed it would last forever, are all dead now, Their bones turned to dust in the family mausoleum on Staten Island. Their names are barely remembered except by historians and their own descendants, mentioned occasionally in books and documentaries, but no longer carrying the weight and power they once did. The Vanderbilt name that once opened every door, that commanded respect and fear and envy, is now just history, interesting perhaps but no longer relevant to how the world actually works. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion teaches us, with brutal clarity, that nothing lasts. Not wealth, not power, not beauty, not even monuments built in stone by the finest craftsmen money can buy. It teaches us that fortunes rise and fall according to economic cycles we barely understand and can't control. It teaches us that social orders crumble and evolve as values change and new generations reject the certainties their parents took for granted. It teaches us that even the most powerful families eventually fade into history. Their empires divided and dissipated, their influence evaporated, their names reduced to footnotes in history books. It teaches us that America has never been comfortable with kings or aristocracy or private palaces, that our democratic values will eventually assert themselves and tear down monuments to inequality, no matter how beautiful those monuments might be. But the mansion teaches us something else as well, something perhaps more important and more hopeful. It teaches us that the attempt itself matters, that the act of creation has intrinsic value even when the creation doesn't endure for centuries. Cornelius Vanderbilt II dreamed of building something permanent, something that would keep his family's name alive forever, something that would stand as a monument to his achievement and his ambition. And for 45 years, that dream existed in physical form. For 45 years, the mansion stood on Fifth Avenue, inspiring awe in everyone who saw it, setting standards for architectural excellence, providing employment for hundreds of workers and craftsmen, hosting events that shaped American society and culture. Thousands of people walked through those doors during those 45 years. They experienced magnificence most humans will never know. They stood in rooms that made them feel something beyond their ordinary lives, that lifted their spirits and expanded their sense of what was possible. They climbed that grand staircase and felt, however briefly, that they had ascended into a different realm where beauty and luxury were the air you breathed. They danced in that ballroom and felt the golden walls reflecting their own glory back at them. They left those parties carrying memories they would treasure for the rest of their lives. Memories they would tell their children and grandchildren about. Memories that would survive long after the building itself was demolished and forgotten. The building is gone now, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. But the story remains. The photographs survive, faded and yellowed but still powerful, still able to convey something of what was lost. The architectural drawings exist in archives, detailed blueprints that show exactly how the building was constructed, that allow us to reconstruct it at least in imagination. The accounts written by people who were there, who attended parties and worked as servants and visited as tourists, survive in letters and diaries and newspaper articles, fragments of lived experience that historians have pieced together to create a fuller picture. The impact of the mansion echoes through time, influencing how we think about wealth and architecture and the American dream, shaping our understanding of the Gilded Age and what it meant. The mansion's destruction itself became part of the story, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of all human achievement, a reminder that nothing we build will last forever no matter how carefully we construct it or how much we invest in its preservation. The photographs of the demolition, showing the mansion in various stages of destruction, walls collapsing and rooms exposed to the sky and workmen standing on piles of rubble, became iconic images of change and loss. Symbols of how time and economics and shifting values destroy even the most impressive monuments. Those images are shown in classrooms and museums now, used to teach students about the Gilded Age and its end, about the transformation of American cities, about the conflict between preservation and progress that every generation must navigate. In the end, perhaps this is the only immortality any of us can hope for. Not buildings that last for millennia, not monuments that resist the erosion of time, not physical structures that can be touched and walked through centuries after their creators are dead. But stories. Stories that continue to be told and retold, that get passed down through generations, that evolve and change but never completely disappear. Stories that teach lessons about ambition and loss, about hubris and humility, about what endures and what vanishes like smoke. Cornelius Vanderbilt II wanted to build something eternal, and in a strange way that he never imagined and probably wouldn't have accepted, he succeeded. The stones of his mansion are gone, scattered or crushed to dust. The gold leaf has been scraped away and melted down for its precious metal content. The marble has been broken and reused in other buildings where no one knows or cares about its origin. The beauty that took decades to create and cost millions to achieve was destroyed in months and exists now only in photographs and memories and the imagination of those who study history. But the story endures. The story of a man who worked himself to death building an empire and a monument to house it. The story of a palace that was supposed to last forever but survived less than half a century. The story of a dream that became a burden and a burden that had to be released. That story is still being told today, nearly a century after the mansion's demolition. It's being told in history books and documentaries and museum exhibitions. It's being told in academic papers that analyze the architecture and the economics and the social dynamics of the Gilded Age. It's being told in tour guides, speeches when they take visitors to see the few Gilded Age mansions that did survive, using the Vanderbilt Mansion as a cautionary tale about what happens when preservation fails. It's being told whenever people debate the value of preserving historic buildings versus allowing progress and development. With the mansion serving as the ultimate example of what can be lost when economics trumps culture. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe the story is more important than the stones ever were. Maybe memory is more valuable than marble. Maybe the ability to inspire and teach and move people emotionally is more lasting than any physical structure could be. The Vanderbilt Mansion existed for 45 years in physical form, but it has existed for nearly a century now in story form. And in story form, it will continue to exist as long as people are interested in American history, as long as we wonder about how the wealthy lived in the Gilded Age, as long as we struggle with questions about permanence and change and what truly matters. Cornelius Vanderbilt II is dead. His wife Alice is dead. Their children and grandchildren who ordered the mansion's demolition are dead. Everyone who ever walked through those doors, who ever danced in that ballroom, who ever climbed that grand staircase, everyone who experienced the mansion firsthand is dead now. Gone for decades, their bones turned to dust in cemeteries across America. The mansion itself is gone just as completely, demolished so thoroughly that not a trace remains on the land where it stood. But we're still talking about it. We're still thinking about it. We're still trying to understand what it meant and why it mattered and what lessons it has to teach us about ambition and mortality and the American experience. The mansion lives on in our collective memory, in our cultural consciousness, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we wanted to be. It lives on as a symbol of both achievement and excess, of beauty and waste, of ambition and hubris. It lives on as a reminder that nothing lasts forever, that even the grandest dreams eventually crumble, that time defeats everyone and everything eventually. But it also lives on as proof that the attempt matters, that creating beauty and pursuing excellence and dreaming big have value even when the creation doesn't endure, even when the beauty fades, even when the dream ends in dust and silence. Standing on that corner today with your eyes open to the reality of modern Manhattan, you might feel a strange mixture of emotions. Sadness for what was lost, yes. That beautiful building, that masterpiece of architecture and craftsmanship, destroyed for no reason except that the world had changed and no longer valued what it represented. But maybe also acceptance, maybe even peace. Because nothing was going to save that mansion. No amount of money or effort or love was going to preserve it once economic and social forces had turned against it. The Gilded Age ended, as all ages end. The values that created the mansion were rejected, as values are always eventually rejected by new generations seeking new ways to live. The dream died, as all dreams eventually die when dreamers pass away and their heirs must deal with reality rather than vision. The Vanderbilt Mansion is gone, and it's never coming back. The world that created it is gone too, vanished as completely as the building itself. We live in a different time now, with different values, different dreams, different ideas about what matters and what should be preserved. We can't go back. We can't rebuild what was destroyed. We can't resurrect the Gilded Age or restore the mansion or bring back the people who lived there. All we can do is remember. All we can do is try to understand. All we can do is learn from what happened and carry those lessons forward into an uncertain future. And maybe that's the ultimate legacy of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion. Not the building itself, which is gone forever. Not the physical beauty, which was demolished and discarded. But the lesson it teaches us, the story it tells, the questions it forces us to confront about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice, and what truly lasts when everything else fades away. The mansion is gone. The story remains. And in remaining, in being told and retold to each new generation, the story becomes the monument. The memory becomes the palace. The tale itself becomes eternal in a way that stone and marble never could be.